December 31st, 2006, a wire transfer of $83 million moved from the British Treasury to the United States government. It was unremarkable by modern standards. No headlines, no ceremony, just another international payment processed through the global banking system. But this payment closed a chapter that had been open for 61 years. Britain had just made the final installment on World War II. 3 generations of British citizens had spent their entire lives paying America for the privilege of not being conquered by Hitler. And here's what makes this story devastating. That debt wasn't payment for winning the war. It was the price America extracted from Britain for the right to keep fighting. The interest payments, the ones that lasted 6 decades, those were just the visible part of the transaction. The real cost was buried in forced asset sales, liquidated investments, and surrendered military bases. Between 1940 and 1945, while Britain was fighting for survival against Nazi Germany, the United States executed the most sophisticated wealth extraction operation in modern history. Britain entered the war as the world's largest creditor nation. The British Empire spanned a quarter of the Earth's surface. British banks financed global trade. The pound sterling was the currency that mattered. Britain exited the war completely bankrupt. Gold reserves emptied. Investment portfolios liquidated. Military bases leased to America for 99 years. And $31 billion in debt, equivalent to $486 billion today. But the real cost wasn't measured in dollars, it was measured in the empire itself. Because what happened between 1940 and 1945 wasn't an alliance between equals. It was a foreclosure. The United States didn't save Britain. It bought Britain. And it did so with such precision, such calculated ruthlessness, that most people still believe the transaction was charity. This is how it actually worked. The mechanics of the extraction, the names of the men who engineered it, the exact moment when Churchill realized he was negotiating Britain's liquidation, not its rescue. And why understanding this isn't about World War II history. It's about understanding how power actually transfers between nations, not through military conquest, but through debt instruments and forced sales during crisis. Because the playbook used on Britain in 1941 is still being used today on every nation that makes the mistake of becoming dependent on American financial support. On December 8, 1940, Winston Churchill sat down to write the most consequential letter of his political career. It was addressed to Franklin Roosevelt, and it opened with a detailed assessment of Britain's strategic position. U-boats were destroying merchant shipping in the Atlantic. The Luftwaffe was bombing British cities nightly. The British Army was retreating on every front. Churchill needed equipment, weapons, aircraft, tanks, ammunition, everything. And then, halfway through the letter, Churchill wrote the sentence that would determine Britain's future. The moment has come when British financial resources are no longer adequate to purchase American supplies. That was diplomatic language. The translation was simpler and more brutal. Britain was completely broke. 7 months into a war that would last 6 years, the British Treasury had run out of money. This letter is taught in history classes as Churchill's desperate appeal to Roosevelt. The moment when Britain asked America for help against Hitler. But read it carefully. Read what Churchill is actually negotiating. He's not asking for aid. He's proposing the terms under which Britain will surrender its economic sovereignty in exchange for the right to continue fighting. Before September 1939, Britain was the wealthiest nation on Earth. Not prosperous, not successful, the wealthiest. The British Empire covered 13.7 million square miles, 24% of the world's land surface. India, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Egypt, large portions of the Middle East and Africa, all under British control. British citizens owned $22 billion in overseas investments. That's equivalent to $450 billion in today's currency. British companies owned railroads in Argentina, copper mines in Chile, rubber plantations in Malaysia, oil fields in Persia. The City of London was the undisputed financial center of the world. More capital flowed through London than any other city. The pound sterling was the global reserve currency. Every major trade contract was denominated in pounds. Central banks held British government bonds as their primary reserves. Britain's gold reserves totaled $6 billion, more than any nation except the United States. In 7 months of war, all of that evaporated. The gold was gone. The investments were being liquidated. The empire was being strip-mined to pay American bills. How did this happen so quickly? Because the United States demanded it. When war was declared in September 1939, the United States was officially neutral. Congress had passed the Neutrality Acts specifically to prevent America from being drawn into another European conflict. The American public wanted nothing to do with Europe's wars, but the Neutrality Acts contained a provision that would financially destroy Britain. Cash and carry. The law stated that belligerent nations could purchase American weapons and supplies, but only under specific conditions. They had to pay in full, upfront, in gold or dollars, no credit, no loans, no payment plans, and they had to transport the goods on their own ships, using their own fuel, at their own risk. Gold on the table before anything left American docks. Britain had no choice. British factories were converting to war production. There was no time to build the industrial capacity needed to fight Germany. The weapons had to come from somewhere, and the only source was America, the factories of Detroit and Pittsburgh, the steel mills of Pennsylvania, the aircraft manufacturers of California. So Britain paid. In June 1940, Britain launched Operation Fish. It was the largest movement of wealth in human history. Britain loaded its entire gold reserves onto battleships and converted ocean liners. Thousands of gold bars. Securities representing billions in investments. Britain's entire national treasure. And they shipped it across the U-boat-infested Atlantic to vaults in Canada and the United States. Think about the risk. German submarines were sinking ships daily. A single torpedo could have sent billions in gold to the bottom of the Atlantic. But Britain had no alternative. The gold had to reach America, or the weapons would stop flowing. By November 1940, the gold was gone. All of it. $6 billion in reserves, accumulated over centuries, liquidated in 8 months. But Britain was still signing contracts, still ordering aircraft and tanks, still committing to purchases that would take years to fulfill. And in London, the Treasury was sending increasingly desperate cables to the British Purchasing Commission in Washington. There are no dollars left. We cannot pay. Britain was 7 months into a war that would last 6 years, and the money had already run out. This is where the mythology of Lend-Lease begins. The story taught in schools goes like this. Roosevelt wanted to help Britain, but he faced political opposition from isolationists in Congress. So he devised a clever program called Lend-Lease. America would lend equipment to Britain, and Britain would return it after the war. Roosevelt even explained it with a folksy metaphor. If your neighbor's house is on fire, you don't sell him your garden hose. You lend it to him, and he gives it back when the fire's out. It was a beautiful story. It presented America as the generous neighbor helping a friend in crisis. The reality was completely different. The real negotiations over Lend-Lease took place behind closed doors between the U.S. Treasury and increasingly desperate British officials. And the man leading the American side was Henry Morgenthau, Jr., Roosevelt's Treasury Secretary and closest economic advisor. Morgenthau was not interested in garden hoses or neighborly assistance. He was interested in stripping Britain of every remaining asset before providing a single dollar of aid. In December 1940, before Lend-Lease was even approved by Congress, before Roosevelt had made his public case, Morgenthau made a demand. He wanted a complete audit of the British Empire. Every asset owned by the British government. Every asset owned by private British citizens, anywhere in the world. Britain was fighting for its survival. London was being bombed every night. British cities were burning. And America's price for considering aid was that Britain open every financial record to a foreign government and prove definitively that it was completely destitute. The British negotiators were led by Sir Frederick Phillips, a career Treasury official. Phillips was stunned by the demand. He argued that Britain had already sold its gold. He explained that forcing the sale of long-term investments during wartime would mean accepting fire sale prices. Pennies on the dollar. He warned that stripping Britain of its overseas income would leave the country unable to recover after the war. Morgenthau's response was cold and unambiguous. If Britain still owns assets in the United States, why should American taxpayers subsidize the war effort? Liquidate everything you own, then we'll discuss aid. Congress debated Lend-Lease through January and February of 1941. Isolationist congressmen argued that Britain was exaggerating its financial crisis. They claimed Britain was secretly wealthy and was trying to trick America into paying its bills. Morgenthau needed proof. He needed a public sacrifice that would demonstrate Britain's desperation. He found it in the American Viscose Corporation. American Viscose was the largest manufacturer of rayon and artificial silk in the United States. It was a highly profitable company worth over $125 million, and it was owned by Courtaulds, a British textile conglomerate. American Viscose generated $10 million in annual dividends that flowed back to London. For the British economy, it was a stable source of dollar income. Losing it would be devastating. Morgenthau told the British negotiators that American Viscose had to be sold immediately. The proceeds would be deposited in the U.S. Treasury to pay for weapons Britain had already ordered. The British resisted. Selling American Viscose under these conditions would be financial suicide. The whole world would know Britain was being forced to sell. Every buyer would lowball their offers. But Morgenthau gave them an ultimatum. Sell American Viscose, or Lend-Lease dies in Congress. On March 15, 1941, the British government seized American Viscose from its private owners under emergency war powers. There was no negotiation with Courtaulds, no fair market assessment. The British government simply took it. Then they put it up for sale. American investment bankers handled the transaction, and every banker knew Britain had no choice but to sell. They drove merciless bargains. American Viscose sold for $54.4 million, half its actual value. The British government paid Courtaulds in pounds sterling in London, adding to Britain's already crushing domestic debt. The dollars from the sale went directly to the U.S. Treasury. This wasn't a transaction between allies. This was a foreclosure. America was liquidating British assets at distressed prices while Britain was fighting for its life against Nazi Germany. But American Viscose was only the beginning. Morgenthau forced Britain to sell $650 million in U.S. securities. Stocks held by British citizens in American companies. Investment portfolios that British families had built over generations. Shares in railroads, mining companies, industrial corporations. All of it liquidated. All of it sold in a market that knew Britain was desperate. By mid-1941, Britain had liquidated $1.1 billion American investments. That's equivalent to $22 billion today. The U.S. Treasury tracked every sale, verified every transaction, made sure the proceeds went toward existing weapons contracts. Only after Britain had proven it owned nothing left in America did the first Lend-Lease funds begin to flow. But the humiliation went far beyond financial assets. In September 1940, months before Lend-Lease was even proposed, Britain negotiated the destroyers for bases agreement. Britain desperately needed destroyers. German U-boats were sinking merchant ships faster than Britain could replace them. The Battle of the Atlantic was being lost. Britain needed convoy escorts immediately. Roosevelt agreed to transfer 50 destroyers to Britain. But these weren't modern warships. They were World War I-era destroyers that had been sitting in mothballs for 2 decades. Obsolete, rusting, barely seaworthy. The U.S. Navy didn't want them. In exchange for these 50 obsolete ships, Britain gave the United States 99-year leases on military bases. Newfoundland, Bermuda, the Bahamas, Jamaica, St. Lucia, Trinidad, Antigua, British Guiana. 8 strategic bases across the Western Hemisphere and the Caribbean. Think carefully about this exchange. Britain surrendered strategic control over the entire Western Hemisphere for 99 years. America gained the ability to project military power across the Atlantic and throughout the Caribbean. The foundation of American hemispheric dominance was laid. In exchange for 50 ships that barely functioned, It was the geopolitical equivalent of pawning your house for grocery money. The Lend-Lease Act finally passed Congress on March 11, 1941. It authorized $7 billion initially. That figure would eventually grow to $50 billion for all allied nations. Britain would receive $31 billion over 4 years. The propaganda called it the arsenal of democracy. Roosevelt declared that America would be the great arsenal, supplying the weapons to defeat tyranny. And Lend-Lease did keep Britain in the war. Without American supplies, Britain would have been starved into submission within months. But Lend-Lease was not a gift, it was a lease. The name itself reveals the structure. Britain was leasing American equipment with the explicit understanding that there would be a reckoning. And buried in the Lend-Lease Agreement, in Article 7, was the clause that would destroy what remained of the British Empire. Article 7 required that Britain eliminate imperial preference after the war. The language was deliberately vague. It called for the elimination of discriminatory treatment in international commerce. It sounded benign: free trade, open markets, liberal economic principles. But discriminatory treatment was code. What it actually meant was imperial preference. Imperial preference was the economic architecture that held the British Empire together. It was a tariff system where goods produced in Britain received preferential rates throughout the empire. Canada bought British cars because British cars had lower tariffs than American cars. Australia bought British machinery because British machinery was cheaper due to preferential treatment. India, South Africa, New Zealand, all the dominions and colonies, they bought British products because the tariff structure made British goods artificially competitive. This system protected British industry. American cars were better. American machinery was more efficient. American consumer goods were superior. But in empire markets, British products were cheaper because of the tariff walls. Article 7 required Britain to dismantle those walls. After the war, Britain would have to open empire markets to American competition. British negotiators understood immediately what this meant. It was the death warrant for the British Empire as an economic unit. Once American companies could compete freely in empire markets, British industry would be obliterated. But German bombers were overhead. U-boats were in the Atlantic. Britain signed. Britain fought World War II with American equipment. But Britain paid for that equipment by liquidating the empire and promising to destroy what remained after the war. As the war continued through 1942, 1943, and 1944, the wealth transfer accelerated. American industry exploded. U.S. GDP grew 75% during the war years. American factories produced weapons for the war effort and consumer goods for global export markets simultaneously. Britain, meanwhile, converted every factory to total war production. Every resource went toward defeating Germany. Britain stopped exporting. British companies abandoned markets in Latin America, Asia, Africa. And who filled those markets? American companies. While British factories produced Spitfires and nothing else, American factories produced bombers and refrigerators, radios and tanks, cars and artillery. The United States was fighting the war and capturing Britain's global commercial position at the same time. By 1944, the transfer was complete. 2/3 of the world's gold reserves sat in Fort Knox. The financial center of gravity had shifted permanently from London to New York, but Britain believed the sacrifice would be honored. British officials convinced themselves that because Britain had fought alone for 2 years, because Britain had bankrupted itself defeating Hitler, America would be generous when the war ended. They believed that the special relationship meant something. They were catastrophically wrong. On August 15, 1945, Japan surrendered. World War II was over. In London, massive crowds gathered outside Buckingham Palace. Churchill appeared on the balcony. The war was won. 7 days later, President Harry Truman signed Executive Order 9620. Lend-Lease was terminated. Immediately, completely. No warning. No transition period. American supply ships in the middle of the Atlantic were ordered to turn around and return to the United States. The lifeline was cut. The British government was paralyzed. They had assumed aid would continue during Reconstruction. The British economy had been completely distorted for total war production. Converting factories back to civilian production would take years. Britain was importing half its food and nearly all its raw materials, all of it paid for with Lend-Lease dollars. Without those dollars, Britain would face mass starvation within months. John Maynard Keynes, the most brilliant economist of the 20th century, calculated that Britain was facing a financial catastrophe worse than anything during the war. He called it a financial Dunkirk. Within months, Britain would have to default on international payments, stop importing food, and implement rationing at starvation levels. There was only one option. Britain had to beg America for a loan. In September 1945, Keynes traveled to Washington. He was 62 years old and dying. Heart disease was killing him. He would be dead within months, but he went to America because no one else could make the case. Keynes believed he had a moral argument. Britain had fought alone for 2 years while America stayed neutral. Britain had sacrificed its entire economy, bankrupted itself for Western civilization. Therefore, America owed Britain a grant. $6 billion, not a loan, a gift. Retroactive payment for Britain's sacrifice. Keynes called it justice. But when Keynes arrived in Washington and sat down with American negotiators, he discovered that justice wasn't a currency the Americans recognized. The American negotiators, led by Treasury official Fred Vinson, were unmoved by moral arguments. The war was over. Congress was tired of funding Europe. The American public wanted their soldiers home and their taxes lowered. And Congress was deeply suspicious of Britain's new labor government, which had been elected on a platform of nationalizing industries and building a welfare state. The Americans made an offer, not a grant, a loan. $3.75 billion at 2% annual interest. It was barely enough to prevent starvation, and it came with conditions specifically designed to destroy what remained of British economic independence. The most devastating condition was sterling convertibility. The Americans demanded that within 1 year of receiving the loan, Britain must make the pound fully convertible. Anyone holding British pounds could walk into any bank and exchange them for US dollars at the official rate. The Americans presented this as free trade, removing currency restrictions, opening markets. But it was a trap, and Keynes knew it immediately. During the war, Britain had forced its colonies and trading partners to accept payment in pounds. But Britain had forbidden them from converting those pounds into dollars. This created a closed financial loop. Countries like India, Australia, Egypt, they held billions in pounds, but they could only spend those pounds on British goods. The system artificially supported British exports and British industry. The Americans wanted that system destroyed. They knew that the moment the pound became convertible, every country holding pounds would immediately sell them to buy dollars. Because American goods were superior, American products were what the world wanted, the pound would collapse. British industry would be finished. Keynes fought against the convertibility clause until his health broke completely. But the alternative was starvation. Britain had no leverage, no options, no choice. The Anglo-American Loan Agreement was signed in July 1946. Keynes died in April 1946. His heart gave out under the stress of trying to save his country from its closest ally. The winter of 1947 was the coldest in British history. Blizzards buried the country. Coal supplies froze. Power stations shut down. People froze in unheated homes. Britain was colder, hungrier, and more miserable than at any point during the war. And in the middle of this frozen hell, the American deadline arrived. On July 15, 1947, Britain made the pound sterling fully convertible as required by the loan agreement. The result was immediate financial massacre. The moment convertibility began, the world rushed to dump pounds for dollars. Countries that had been holding sterling for years unloaded everything. In 1 month, Britain lost hundreds of millions of dollars from the loan. The hemorrhage was so catastrophic that after just 5 weeks, Britain was forced to suspend convertibility. Britain had burned through a quarter of the American loan in 5 weeks and achieved nothing except humiliation. The financial collapse had immediate geopolitical consequences. In February 1947, Britain sent a telegram to the U.S. State Department. For a century, Britain had maintained military forces in Greece and Turkey, blocking Soviet expansion into the Mediterranean. The telegram was brief. We can no longer afford it. We're withdrawing. If you want to contain communism, you'll have to do it yourselves. This triggered the Truman Doctrine. The United States stepped in to fill the vacuum Britain was leaving across the globe. It was the formal acknowledgement that Britain was no longer a superpower. In 1949, Britain devalued the pound from $4.03 to $2.80. Overnight, the British people became 30% poorer relative to the rest of the world. But the final humiliation was the debt itself. The Anglo-American loan of 1946 was not forgiven. It was a standard commercial debt with 2% annual interest. Every year for 6 decades, the British Treasury wrote a check to the United States Treasury. Through the economic boom of the 1950s, through the inflation crises of the 1970s, through Thatcherism and privatization, through the Blair years, the payments continued. The final payment was made on December 29, 2006, 61 years after victory in World War II. So who actually benefited from this extraction? Let me show you the names. Henry Morgenthau Jr. orchestrated the entire liquidation as Treasury Secretary. After the war, Morgenthau retired wealthy and respected. He never faced consequences for stripping an ally during its most desperate hour. The American banks that handled the forced liquidation of British assets made millions in fees. J.P. Morgan, Goldman Sachs, all of them facilitated the fire sales and profited from Britain's desperation. American corporations that bought British assets at distressed prices made fortunes. American Viscose, purchased for $54 million, was worth over $125 million. The buyers more than doubled their money instantly. The military-industrial complex that supplied Lend-Lease equipment made billions. Boeing, Lockheed, Ford, General Motors, all were paid by the U.S. government, which billed Britain. These companies grew wealthy while Britain went bankrupt, buying their products. And the United States government itself. By 1945, the United States held 2/3 of the world's gold reserves. The dollar had replaced the pound as the global reserve currency. American military bases encircled the planet. The U.S. had achieved complete global dominance. Not through military conquest, through debt and forced liquidation during crisis. The British Empire wasn't defeated by Germany, it was purchased by the United States. America acquired the assets, the military bases, the global markets, and the geopolitical position in what amounted to a distressed asset sale managed by the U.S. Treasury, while Britain was fighting for survival. This wasn't unique to Britain. The same playbook has been deployed on every American ally since 1945. Germany was rebuilt through the Marshall Plan, but Marshall Plan aid came with conditions. Germany had to open its markets completely to American goods, host American military bases permanently, align its foreign policy with Washington. By the 1960s, Germany was prosperous but utterly dependent. Japan after 1945 was occupied and economically restructured. The Japanese economy was rebuilt with American capital, but Japan became a protectorate. U.S. military bases remain in Japan today. Japan holds over $1 trillion in U.S. Treasury bonds. Japan cannot pursue independent foreign policy without American approval. South Korea after the Korean War. American military presence. American economic influence. South Korea is wealthy, but strategically it remains completely dependent on American protection. The pattern repeats everywhere. Crisis creates dependency. Dependency requires concessions. Concessions transfer wealth and sovereignty to the United States. Britain in 1940 wasn't conquered by Germany. It was conquered by the United States using debt instruments, forced asset liquidation, and contractual clauses disguised as alliance. The mythology of World War II teaches that America saved Britain from Nazi Germany. The reality is that America bought Britain while Britain was fighting for its life. And Britain is still paying. Understanding this isn't about hating America or revising history for ideological purposes. It's about seeing how power actually operates. Modern empires aren't built through obvious military conquest. They're built through finance, debt structures, and crisis exploitation. When your ally is desperate, when the bombs are falling, when starvation is imminent, That's when you extract maximum concessions. That's when you force the liquidation. That's when you rewrite the terms in your favor. The special relationship between the United States and Britain is celebrated as an alliance between equals, a bond forged in shared sacrifice. But read the actual documents. Look at the numbers. Britain gave everything. America took everything. In December 1940, Winston Churchill wrote to Franklin Roosevelt asking for help. In doing so, he signed the deed of sale for the British Empire. He traded Britain's global position for the right to continue fighting Hitler. It was a deal that had to be made. There was no alternative. But the cost was the future. Britain won the war. Britain defeated Hitler. But Britain lost the empire and its position as a great power. And Britain was bankrupted by its closest ally. 3 generations of British taxpayers spent their entire lives paying America for the privilege of surviving World War II. The Lend-Lease agreement wasn't the arsenal of democracy. It was the greatest asset-stripping operation in history, executed with legal precision and financial ruthlessness while Britain was fighting for survival. The final payment was made in 2006, but the consequences of that transaction still shape the world today.